for this session, but we don't have long to make changes to adaptation either. So even though I feel outraged I don't have an hour session, we've got 25 minutes. But very much with regard to the challenge that we face in a very short time frame, I would like to introduce our panel. We have Professor Leslie Hughes, who we've heard from this morning, Dr. Gail Braganza from BOM. We have, to my right, Russell Seaman, who is the manager of the Native Vegetation Unit, but also doing some interesting projects on carbon sequestration. And we have Professor Sarah Wheeler from Adelaide University, from an economics, really, perspective. So, look, I have had a script and I'm going to go off that script, and the session really is about, you know, adapt, transform, migrate, what are the options? But before we get there, I sort of feel I need to reflect on this morning's session, because I feel there's something that we haven't quite discussed. There seems to be a problem. So unlike the Christmas pimpernel, I put island bat, but I know that's not right, pimpernel, we do have the knowledge, and we've had it for like 20, 30, 40 years in some shape or form. Leslie's shown the amount of papers that have been done regarding NRM and adaptation. Carl's shown the slides and the data and of climate data. So we really have had the science and we've had the evidence base, but there's a translation. And so I'd like to use this session to maybe sort of open up a discussion on some of those issues and problems regarding either the science, either some cultural issues regarding to things like we spoke about native vegetation plantings and provenance, maybe the failure of people like me who are just not getting the policy right, or maybe I'm writing policy just to make sure that it gets through a cabinet, and then maybe that will it'll be so inoffensive that no one will know. And maybe that's all just, we're not getting to where we need to get to. So I'd like us to talk a little bit about the problem, and then, but I really want to finish the session about some positive actual actions that we can all do, because we all have a responsibility in this room to actually start putting some action into decision making in our daily jobs and elsewhere. So maybe I can start with Carl. Can you tell me, Carl, about the science from the Bureau of Meteorology, the data you've had, and the fact that we've had it for such a long time, but we're still not quite getting there in taking the action, maybe at a policy making level? What do you think policymakers can do with the science differently that we haven't been doing?
I think... Hello? Yes. Probably going back to what I said about understanding our vulnerabilities, and we haven't quite done that to the extent that we can to make use of the data itself. So what we've typically embarked on is asking the climate scientists to deliver that risk information, and often we actually don't have the tools to translate that into something that relates to the macroeconomics or that relates to ecology or environmental management. And we've done it in an environment where we have traditionally not wanted to be alarmist. So we've presented things in a way that, you know, not so long ago was about, look, this is a really serious problem, we want you to pay attention to it. Now we're kind of saying, look, or we're being asked, can you give us the information that we need for us to manage our risk? And it takes a while to spin up that data and that knowledge, and we are a little bit behind in that. But I think, yeah, approaching this from a standard risk management framework is what we would really advocate.
So that would be a change from what we're doing now, moving from having the information and knowledge, but applying it in a risk management framework.
And across all, so if we just focus on a jurisdiction or a government, it's having it across all departments. Or if it's in an institution or a business, it's not necessarily in the ESG part alone. It's not just about your environmental sustainability. It's actually your CFO that needs to understand this as well. And we're seeing that shift now, and you're seeing at the federal level as well. There's now interest from 10 or 12 government departments in what climate risk means for their operational environment. And yeah, it takes a while to actually have the data in a form that suits that, and actually having the questions framed correctly in the first instance is pretty important. And I think coming up with a framework for doing this is pretty important, and we don't have that at the moment. I don't know if people are aware, but internationally there is this thing called the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. So listed companies around the world are embarking on a scenario-based exercise to understand their risk, but and even just focusing on Australia, we don't actually have a framework for doing that. So you might get people accessing different data sets, different risk formulations. So how do we actually compare risk across two cohorts that probably share the same risk space? And coming up with that it's an imperative. We need to do that now, and it's not just in the domain of the climate science, it's in the domain of everyone that wants to use that data as well.
Great, thank you. Maybe Leslie, I'd like to sort of follow up on some of the comments you made earlier about maybe some of the more cultural things. So a little bit like was Carl saying, we provided information and it was sort of safe, saying here's what's going to happen, but then it wasn't being used in any way, any sort of proactive way, in an action-based way. Your comments on like the provenance of plantings, that it's not just about the managers on ground, it's about everyone working in a bit of a safe space. Maybe you could provide a bit more comment on that.
Yes, I think, well, we all want to be safe, and that's part of the problem of communicating climate change, is that really to grasp the full import of climate risk is to not be in a safe place at all. But look, I think people have talked about the gulf between research and science and policy for many decades, and there's issues on both sides. So for scientists like me that work in an academic institution, the sort of reward systems that operate in academic institutions are not actually about impact as the layperson would measure impact of applied research. And I should say, any research on climate change by its nature, it should be applied research. It's an applied problem. Instead, we get rewarded if other scientists sitting in their labs and offices cite our papers, and we cite their papers and they cite our papers, and we go round and round in this sort of academic bubble, whereas what we need to do is leak out of that bubble to the rest of the world. So there's a reward system that operates for researchers, in the university space at least, that doesn't promote actually getting out and making sure your research has impact. On the other side, yes, there is I think there's a real conservatism in terms of policy. If I come back to my example of translocation, the amount of hoops that you need to go through to actually translocate a species, the criteria in most states are written in such a way that you would never meet them and be able to translocate something. So moving a tortoise from here to there is so difficult, yet we still have lots of legislation, my own state being an example, where broad-scale land clearing is still possible. So on the one hand, we can clear vast hectares of land. On the other hand, it's too difficult from a policy perspective to move a tortoise from point A to point B. So I think we need to think about that mismatch of scale and that cognitive dissonance that I spoke about earlier. But there's fault on both sides.
Thanks, Leslie. I'd like to pick this up with Sarah too. So with regard to the policy making and the applied, in driving rural industries to adapt, Sarah, can't wait for government policy in sometimes because things are happening at such a rapid pace. How important is the policy, and how important is the work that you do just to get out on the ground and do things in rural industries?
Okay, so a lot of my work is about how do we get irrigators, farmers, consumers to adapt to a hotter world. And I think governments can play a big role in many different areas. I mean, I often call it the 5 Ps. So we can do projects, things such as infrastructure, we can police, put legislation in place, we can set up property rights, and this is to do with water and carbon markets, which can be a very big driver of behavioural change. We can do pricing, such as pricing our natural resources to try and get people to look after it in different ways. And we can persuade in terms of we can educate and try and change behaviour in that way. Now, I think governments and people in general and councils, etc., they're very good at trying to get people to do, say, one action, to adopt one sort of thing. and use one sort of tool to do that. What we're not good is at trying to get people to transform their behaviour. And by transforming behaviour, especially in the farming sector, for example, you know, you need to have a whole suite of different behaviour if you're going to cope with a hotter world. And by that I mean, you know, we might have to do corridors, not clear trees, look at crop cover, changing crop mix, whether it involves adopting new infrastructure, adopting new ways of doing things, moving from conventional to organic. So that's what I mean by transform. Policy is not really good at this stage, in my opinion, of getting people to transform their behaviour. We're good at trying to get people to adopt certain innovations, but for transformation we need a whole combination of the 5 Ps. So that's what I try and do in my own research, to kind of emphasise that, you know, for real transformational change, we need to look at the full suite of policies that are available to us, and at the same time we need to look at the policies that are causing negative environmental outcomes and get rid of them in the first place.
Thanks, Sarah. So I'm going to bring in Russell here, because all is not lost. We are doing some good policy, and Russell, maybe you can talk about some of the opportunities for some of the transformation, and we're not there yet, but we're starting to look at, especially in the rural sector, farming, agriculture, but also along our coasts, about what are some of the opportunities. Russell, comment on that, please.
Yeah, thanks, Julia. Look, I think the emerging carbon market has been around for quite a while, but it's been quite immature. But I think it's getting to a point where it can start that transformation. So looking at economics around the carbon market, it is all about choice. You're providing landholders more choice, more opportunities to meet a demand that's out there from corporations, facilities that need to meet obligations under the safeguard mechanism, voluntary purchases of carbon credits. So there's no shortage of demand, but there is a shortage of supply. So we can start matching those two essence of economics, and it's all about conversations then. So bringing a conversation to the land sector about opportunities is very important. And the pilots that we're running at the moment have illustrated the importance of these conversations and opening up and spinning off other opportunities. So one property, we're able to look at biodiversity environmental offsets for part of the property. We're able to look at carbon offsets on another part of the property. And that then brings another conversation around the production and what they're producing as a natural resource, the natural capital that they're managing, but also the product they're putting out in the marketplace. So there's real opportunities to meet a purchaser of a carbon credit and the supplier of a primary produce. So we're seeing those relationships building already through particularly the voluntary market, such as airlines buying credits and also putting the produce onto the plane as in-flight meals. So often the actual promotion and the marketing that carbon markets and that conversation can generate, it's actually the promotions probably could be more valuable than the actual carbon value itself. But I'm finding that it starts a conversation, it gets people interested and engaged in a new way of thinking that might be able to transform to a different direction.
This is a very different way of approaching policy, so it's very new, a new way of trying to do things. So I'm mindful of the time and the fact that we need to move on, but I would like to ask each of the panellists maybe one action that we could all just take away today, that we could look at to embedding, to actually sort of maybe takes us out a bit of our comfort and our safe zone, and we can apply to actually start seeing some adaptation, transformational change. Leslie?
Well, I guess my take home would be look ahead. You know, if you're a practitioner doing restoration or, you know, a farmer or whatever, think about what will this place be like in 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, 70 years. Is what I'm doing now preparing, whether it's a livelihood or a conservation strategy, is that sustainable given our current state of knowledge in the long term? So look outside your comfort zone and ahead.
Carl?
Taking up one of Leslie's points, I think sharing that knowledge as well. So really sharing knowledge with your immediate peers outside of your realm and your domain is extremely important, and it's only through those actions that you will actually find that change is facilitated. And there's probably not enough of it if we consider what sort of knowledge brokers do we have that translate knowledge in one domain to another domain and actually collaboratively work together. Not many people have that in their job description, certainly not in academia or in government. So doing that in an effective way is something that I encourage everyone from students up to do.
Thanks, Carl. Russell, you can go.
I'm thinking that, if we wanted to apply an approach, maybe take some knowledge or examples or theory from other disciplines and maybe look at customer preferences and design thinking and really understand who is going to interact with the land sector if we're talking about climate change adaptation in a big way. There might be a missing jigsaw that I don't think we've nailed yet.
Sarah?
Well, I think my key message is get rid of bad policy first and foremost. Land clearing, allowing land clearing, I think is an obvious one. For me, subsidising billions of dollars in irrigation infrastructure is another one. I could go on, I won't, but I think it's an easy one just to stop bad policy, which is causing behaviour that we really don't want in consumers and irrigators and farmers.
Thank you. I'm wondering whether we do have time for a question. Would anybody like to? You've got an esteemed panel here, so perhaps we can, this lady in the 6th row.
Thank you very much. My question's about looking to the future, as you mentioned before, and at the moment it seems like we're looking to the next 50, 80 years with the climate predictions and 2 degrees. Should we be looking further than that, particularly when we're thinking about revegetation, if we're trying to think about a habitat that in 200, 300 years might need hollow logs, and these are the trees we're planting now? So we've only just begun thinking about non-local provenance, but should we be actually thinking even longer term at what species might be around when we need hollow logs for the ones that actually do make it through to that time, for example?
So.
Well, yes, ideally, but I guess pragmatically, from personal experience, I think that most of us have had, even getting people to think a decade or two in advance is hard. So by all means, think a century or two in advance. But I'd prefer to see really good effort thinking 50 years in advance than no effort at all. Hollow logs, yes, they're really important, but we can make artificial hollow logs as well. So I think we shouldn't shy away from, and in fact I think we need to be really thinking about being a far more interventionist and engineers in habitats, because we can do stuff much faster than nature can, and if we're really going to save a lot, we're going to have to be willing to actually take more risk, be more engineering oriented, and be far more interventionist. So, but by all means look ahead a couple of 100 years, but let's get it right looking ahead 50 years first.
Another question? I think this gentleman straight up here was first.
Who is the primary target audience for all of these messages? And if it's the 90% plus of people who live in cities, comfortably driving their cars to work every day, how do we get this message beyond policymakers and landowners and the minority of people who actually live in this country? And is it the majority of the people who live in this country who need to be informed and engaged rather than just the minority?
Well, I'm happy to have a crack at it. So I sort of feel quite hopeful about the ability for people to change, and I think, and Australians on the whole, and I think South Australians in particular, around waste, recycling, solar panel uptake, a whole raft of things that we actually do quite well Cars is slightly different, and I think we will see sort of electric vehicles and hybrids come on. Still very expensive at the moment. So part of the challenge has been a lot of the media side of it around the climate change and the politicisation of it. But on the ground efforts, I think people, and there were some surveys done within the agency about people that visit parks, and beyond that people actually do regard the environment as important, but translating that into absolute action and demand for things like adaptation and good public government policy hasn't quite got there yet. But I'm hopeful that it will and is.
I guess I'd add to that we need to make it easy for people as far as we can. We need to provide people with tools. I think there's tremendous appetite in the Australian public, and we see this in surveys all the time. Firstly, about concern about climate change and the desire to do something, and the dissatisfaction with the level of government action. That is, you know, it's an extraordinary mismatch. I've been talking about mismatches a lot, but one of the big mismatches is between government trajectory and feelings in the community. We see that in the Climate Council that I work for a lot. So I think providing people with tools, people want to do the right thing. And one of my colleagues always says climate change solutions is not, there's no silver bullet, there's silver buckshot. We have to address climate change at every level, from individuals right through to global action. There's no single solution. In fact, all of those solutions have to be brought to bear. But providing people with tools and strategies and making it easy is a good start.
Carl?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think there's aspects of, for example, my domain, climate change, which are regular, everyday problems that we've faced historically. Then there's aspects of it that are quite unique and are going to, involve unique solutions both at the public level and at the policy level. I often get asked, what can we do to communicate to the general public more? It's not clear to me what the role of the general public is. I think they have a role, but we're also talking about difficult economic reform. I'm not sure that the general public has ever led difficult economic reform. If we think about the things that economists champion in Australia, which is removing tariffs, floating the dollar, compulsory superannuation, deregulating banking, none of that was a grassroots, bottom-up people movement. It was experts communicating to policymakers, getting an outcome that they wanted. So again, back to my previous answer, I think focus on the skills that you have. If people are very comfortable communicating to the general public and think that they can gain something from doing that, then go ahead and do that. If you're better at communicating to the heads of agencies and emergency services, then do that. If you're better at talking through the legal system, go and study law and become a lawyer and put yourself at a fulcrum where you can actually push and have an influence. And I think they're the sorts of things that people need to do. A lot of the time people think that they're going to do something small, and I often ask who's doing the heavy lifting here. And if we all say that, well, the heavy lifting is going to be done by someone else, I think that's a problem. People have to consider what it is that they can do to have a meaningful effect. And I don't know what the answer to that question is, but I think it has to be a portfolio of communication responses.
Thanks.
I was just thinking that in a country with compulsory voting, getting an informed public who will vote for a government that will do something would be quite important.
I think Sarah's going to have one last comment, and then I'll wrap up.
Okay. A lot of our research, as I said, is about trying to get farmers, how do we get them to adapt? And in particular, in regards to climate change, farmers' belief about climate change is far different to the general population, okay? So farmers are much less likely to state that they believe climate change is happening. So research that we've been doing is about, well, what is the link between what they believe and what they do on their farm? And how can we change this? Is education going to do it? Is economic incentives going to do it? And some things that we're finding out that the more you can get farmers to adapt to a drier future, whether they believe in climate change or not. It can actually drive and change their beliefs about climate change. So this is why we, as behavioural economists, say, let's focus on behaviour. Attitudes are important, but it's not always the driving factor. And if we can change behaviour, we can change attitudes, and that will again reinforce positive adaptation on farms. So that's one of the messages we put out in terms of when we're trying to target farmers who traditionally are against climate change, mainly because if a lot of farmers think climate change is happening, especially at the levels that we've kind of talked about today, their future on their farm is very much limited, so it's very challenging to them. But that's just something I'd like to put forward.
Thank you. Look, just to finish, I have to finish off myself, but that this coming together alignment of climate, economic policy and the need and the carbon budget, I think we've sort of hit a tipping point where I think that we will have the action we need. Whether it's within the timeframes we need it is the question, but the action, I think the momentum is going. So I'm hopeful, and just to go back to Leslie's slide, you know, everyone in the room, we are the ones that we've been waiting for. So with that, I'd like to thank Sarah Wheeler, Russell Seaman, Carl Braganza and Leslie Hughes. Thank you very much for attending today. Thank you.
Thanks, Julia. Thanks, Julie. Thanks to the panel. So everyone, I apologise, we are running a bit behind schedule. So for those of you going to other lecture theatres, if you could go there as soon as possible, and we'll get started a couple of minutes late for those sessions. And then people staying here will get started in a minute. So thank you.
My name's Graham Green. I'm the Principal Advisor on Climate Change Science in the Department of Environment and Water. I'm going to chair this session for the next 1.5 hours. So this is the first of 3 concurrent sessions. Just so that you're aware, there are other concurrent sessions in the Horace Lamb Theatre and the Flinchy Theatre at the same time as this one. We've got a number of talkers talking for a range of different times, between 12 minutes and 3-minute talks. We need to make up some time, so I'll get straight on to introducing Sarah, who I think most of you have just seen represented on the panel session. So Sarah is going to talk to us about exploring the drivers of farm exit over time in the Murray-Darling Basin. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, thanks for inviting me to come and talk to you today. I'm going to talk about some preliminary results from my future fellowship that I've been working on for the last 4 years. It's about leaving the farm, exploring the long-term drivers of farm exit in the Murray-Darling Basin. And just to jump straight to the conclusion, yes, climate change is playing a part, and a very significant part. So The reason I'm concentrating on the Murray-Darling Basin, it's an area that's seen a lot of reform, especially in the past 100 years. It's an area of great importance to Australia. It's known as our food bowl. It has our largest amount of irrigators within this area, and it produces 60% of food within Australia. This slide is just basically giving you a little bit of history to show the path of water reform in this area. 2012, we passed